When studying vitamins, it's common to look at folate and vitamin B12 or cobalamin together. At first, they can seem like an odd couple. Food sources of folates are primarily plants, and for B12, it's almost exclusively from animal-based foods. And the subpopulations that we worry about when there's a deficiencies are also quite different. With folate, we worry about babies, and with B12, we're more worried about older adults. But their functions overlap, and that's why we look at them together. And we'll start with folate. It does have a number. It's B9. We almost never use it, almost always use the term. Also, there are multiple chemical structures that interchange between itself and the body, so we get different terms associated with that, including the term folic acid. That's the term often on a food label because it's the form that is added to supplements and in fortified foods. But folate is the more generic term, so that is the term I will use. If we look at the RDAs, for males and females, it's 400 micrograms, adults. The typical female adult gets about 460 micrograms, and males get about 600. Remember, it's not wrong to eat above the RDAs, so what we can say is that we get amounts adequate to prevent deficiencies. If we look at our food sources, again, it's the grain groups, the plant groups. So we've got grains, fruits, and vegetables. Grains are our primary source. About 70% of all the folate you consume in a day is going to come from our grains. About another 5% is coming from fruits and about 15% coming from vegetables, and that does include the legumes. If we look at specific foods, we'll look at these graphs, and the brown graph here represents the amount in one serving for folate. And we'll compare the grains first. We'll look at whole grains, and then refined grains here. Whole grains, about one serving, has about 4% of the daily value. And if we compare that to the refined grains have about 11%, so 2 to 3 times the amount that you'd find there in a whole natural amount. And the reason for that is that it is fortified. And we would use the word fortified rather than enrichment. Remember those first B vitamins, thiamine, riboflavin, and niacin, were enriched, added back to the levels that are found there naturally, starting in the 1940s. And we didn't start the fortification of adding folic acid, the form of folate, into refined grades until 1998, so much later. But I'm going to wait and tell a story about why that's later as we discuss the deficiencies and worries about too much. To the food sources, we look at these fruits, we look at these vegetables, much more concentrated generally, as is often the case, but because we eat 6 to 11 servings of grains each day, it is going to be our primary source. If we look at the function of folate, it's with a methyl metabolism in the body, and that's needed with DNA synthesis. Therefore, we will need it for new cell formation. And any cell that is rapidly turning over is going to be vulnerable to inadequate folate levels. And so we frequently think about anemia. Red blood cells turn over rapidly, and when we have adequate red blood folate, these red blood cell precursors will come and form healthy red blood cells. But if we have inadequate folate, we come down here and get these very kind of large, immature cells, red blood cells, which leads to anemia. And we call it megaloblastic anemia, large, immature cells. That is one. So that's one of those cells turning over rapidly. It's vulnerable to folate deficiencies, and it's early symptom. Another time where we have a lot of rapidly turnover cells is when a baby is being developed. And there is an increased risk for neural tube defects when the mother, early in her pregnancy, has inadequate folate levels. An example of that is when the spinal cord does not close and we get a defect called spina bifida. So very early in the first month to 6 weeks of the development of a child, if there's not enough folate, there's an increased incidence. And what happened is when we started understanding that link between folate deficiency and the increased risk for neural tube defects, is they started thinking about fortifying our foods. And so that probably started understanding that in the 1960s, but definitely the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, we understood it well enough that as a nutrition community, we kept trying to get women during their childbearing years to take higher levels of folate, either as a supplement or to take this food's rich in folate. But it wasn't until they decided in 1998, remember we started fortification, that we saw this drop in the incidence of about 20 to 30% in the incidence of neural tube defects. So neural tube defects, I'll abbreviate that. So once we added white flour and white rice in the spaghetti noodles, we actually saw that drop. And you may think, well, if they understood it, starting probably in the 60s, but really in the 80s, they had a clear understanding in the early 90s, why wouldn't they add it to the food supply? Well, we need to take a look at higher levels. First of all, the idea that just high levels of folate. So there's no known negative effects of high folate by itself being high in the blood. But what it can do, it can mask B12 deficiency. Okay, and I'm going to explain that in just a minute, what that means to mask B12 deficiencies. But because of the negative effects possibly on B12 deficiency, they did establish a UL of 1,000 micrograms. So it's not because folate itself is negative, but of this concern of masking B12 deficiency. So let's take a look at B12. B12, it has a name, cobalamin, but we almost always use the number in this instance. If we look at the RDA, 2.4 micrograms, and females get about 4, males on average get 6. So again, we're meeting our need. Our intake is going to be from those animal-based foods. Dairy and the protein food group is the food group of the My Plate, but we need to be specific here. It's not the beans of the protein food group, but those animal-based foods. Dairies provide about 23% of our intake of B12, the dairy group, and then the protein food groups from those animal-based foods provide about the rest of that, 77%. If we look at specific foods, here it's in the lighter blue bars is our B12. So here's milk, which provides in 1 cup about 54% of the daily value. A couple eggs will give 46, 3 ounces of beef, 51%, but look at these beans. Their beans are part of the protein group, but they are non-animal based, so they actually provide no B12. Come back and think about the deficiencies. The deficiencies is similar that we talked about with folate with respect to DNA synthesis, but it's a little more nuanced than that. What we need is that we need B12 to get folate to activate folate. Get folate to the active form. If you don't have enough B12, folate can get trapped in the wrong form that is needed for new cell DNA synthesis and new cell formation. And that's going to lead to its deficiencies. But it's not limited to that function. It's also needed to have healthy nerves. When we don't have enough B12, we're going to have problems with our nerves. So I'm going to look at our deficiencies, but before we get to specific deficiencies, we need to better understand how the body metabolizes B12 after we eat it. And we can identify those groups that are at increased risk. First of all, if we're going to eat it, we're going to have some animal foods. That's going to be our source. So we can have our eggs, we can have milk, we can have chicken, we can have fish, whatever those animal-based foods are going to be there. What we're going to get in those foods, we're going to get B12 linked with a protein. So that is just how animal foods will link B12 in its food products. And the first thing that's going to happen, so we're going to eat it, and change this to a different color here, and we will have B12 linked with protein, give it a different color. And the first thing we need to do, we need to separate those two. They need to be separated. So that's our first task here for digestion, absorption of B12. We need to separate the B12 protein complex in foods. And how we're going to do that, the acid, this acidic stomach, is going to unfold that protein, and that's going to separate it. So that's why this acid in the stomach will actually separate that protein and B12 complex. The next thing that's going to happen is that we're going to need something called the intrinsic factor. So this is 2. We need to produce intrinsic factor. And this is actually happening in the stomach as well. That's where it's produced. Once we get those both down here into, let's get this colored, B12, and it's going to link with that intrinsic factor. So now we have this new complex B12 intrinsic factor. That is going to be identified, I'll put that together here, intrinsic factor at that GI tract level. And then what we can do is that we can, the small intestines, okay, so this is the small intestines, will recognize that B12 intrinsic factor and recognize this combination complex and absorb it. And it actually will separate that as well, and the B12 will go one direction and the intrinsic factor will go another, but it's those are the general 3 steps along the way. We're going to separate the B12 from the protein that is linked in the food itself. The intrinsic factor is formed, and we're going to, in the stomach and in the small intestines, we'll combine it. The small intestines will recognize it and then absorb it, and at that point it actually separates out the intrinsic factor and B12, but generally those are the 3 steps that are going to go on. Now if we come back to this idea of, all right, this is this multiple steps of how we're going to absorb B12, we can identify the groups at risk for B12 deficiency. The first one is going to be vegans. So vegans. Those are the individuals who eat no animal foods. Now, if you are a vegetarian, let's go back to these foods group. A vegetarian would be someone who doesn't eat the flesh of animals. But if you have milk and you have eggs in your diet, you will still get plenty of B12. But if you do not have any animal foods, right, all plant foods are going to have almost no B12. So you are going to be at risk of B12 deficiency because you're not eating a source of it. Another group of individuals at risk are individuals who stop producing the intrinsic factor. And that is a genetic disorder and something that would be a medical condition. So they're going to be at risk because they cannot form that B12 intrinsic factor combination. Then the last group is going to be older adults. And the reason for this is that their stomachs can lower the production of acid. That's not uncommon. After about older adults, we're going to say here's over 50 years of age. In particular, probably 60s and 50s and 60s and 70s. But will anybody above the age 50, as you get older, your stomach produces less acid. And what happens is you cannot separate out that B12 protein complex. These 3 groups are going to be at risk for B12 deficiency. With vegans and with the older adults, you can take a supplement. Because we can still we have intrinsic factor, and in fact with most supplements they actually will take it with just B12. The protein is not linked, but they still have the intrinsic factor to pull it in. If you're someone who has a genetic disorder to stop producing intrinsic factor, you would need to take a shot of B12 and bypass this whole system. But let's get back to our story of the babies and the adults and fortification of folate and why there was a concern. So remember, we had folate we understood it since the 1970s and 80s and early 90s in particular, and there was a debate about adding it to the food supply because they were worried it would mask B12 deficiency. So let's come down here and look at what happens when you have inadequate B12. The term that we associate with B12 deficiency is pernicious anemia. Pernicious is just a general word that means sneaky. And the reason why is one of the first symptoms will be megaloblastic anemia. Megaloblastic anemia. Because we have inadequate active folate. So not being able to activate that folate, it remains in this trapped inactive form, we're going to develop the folate deficiency, which lead to megaloblastic anemia. Now, if we add a bunch of folate at this time, we can actually get enough of that active form. So this B12 activation of folate is not 100%. If you take it in very large amounts of folate, and folic acid, either one of those forms, you can get a little bit of that active folate. It's not 100% limitations. So you can get enough to get that megaloblastic anemia to go away. Now that would seem good, but the problem is this healthy nerve continues to have a problem. We get nerve damage. This image here is of an individual who has megaloblastic anemia. This is a healthy arm, and here's an individual who has had wasting away of the nerves because of this myelin sheaths are not functioning. So we have damaged nerves that will occur, numbing, tingling, all the things that are associated with that. And if we took up in large amounts of folate, this will progress, even if the folate values increase at a level that the megaloblastic anemia go away, it does not limit that nerve damage. So we get the sneaky underlying damage to our nerves. So let's go back to the 1990s, and we have to decide if we're going to add folate to the white flour and the pista and the hamburger buns throughout the United States, because we want to help with babies. We want to get young women who may not plan their pregnancies and not have enough folate even before they're in the pregnancy. The negative defects can occur even before a woman would know she's pregnant. So if we add it to basic food, we can get more into the food supply, but we're afraid about the older adults. And what they decided, that the research shows it probably takes 4,000 to 5,000 micrograms of folate to actually lead to this masking of B12. So they decided to have a UL and add it to the food supply. And we've had this positive impact of a drop in neural tube defects, and we have not seen the increase in pernicious anemia. So the balance between those seem to be correct. Our last box here is related to the toxicity of B12, and this is another one where there is no known negative effects, and so that we have no UL associated with that. So let's summarize why we look at folate and B12 together. We can look at the food supplies. They're quite different. Folate's coming from grains, fruits, and vegetables. B12 are from those animal-based foods. Their functions are overlapped but unique. We have DNA synthesis, and with B12 we needed to activate that folate to get that in a healthy folate function, but it also has its own separate functions, and healthy nerves are part of that. Deficiencies, both of them developed megaloblastic anemia because folate deficiency will occur with both. But with folate deficiency, we have this increased incidence of neural tube defects in developing babies. And with B12, we have this nerve damage that does not go away even if we take in more folate. So they're an odd couple because they're food sources, but they're interrelated, and we could see the public health campaign of being one against the other. But we're going to help those babies if we give folate, and that's what has happened. And then when it comes to those groups that are at risk, the vegans, those that have intrinsic factor disorders, and the older adults, we can help with supplements with those older adults and the vegans, and somebody with intrinsic factor will need to see their physicians to get shots.